It was a quiet evening in Prescott, Arizona. The wind moved slowly across the porch, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and fading sunlight. Richard Harris sat by the window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. He was a retired Army officer, living alone after the loss of his only son, Michael. The framed photo of Michael in uniform sat on the mantel, a reminder of a proud but painful past. When the knock came, it was soft, hesitant, almost afraid. Richard frowned, set his cup down, and opened the door to find a young boy standing there. The boy was thin, no more than 12, his face smeared with dust, his lips cracked from dehydration. He was barefoot, and his clothes were torn, clinging to his bony frame. In his trembling hands, he held out a faded military shirt. "Sir," he said weakly, his voice rough from thirst, "your son gave me this shirt yesterday." Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, he could not speak. His son, Michael Harris, had died 3 years ago in Afghanistan. The boy's words struck like thunder, shaking the ground beneath his certainty. Richard took a cautious step forward. "What did you say, son?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The boy's eyes glistened with tears. "He found me in the desert," he whispered. "He said you would help me." The words hung heavy in the air. Richard looked at the shirt, noticing the faded green fabric, the torn sleeve, and near the pocket, his son's initials, MH, stitched by his late wife. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch it, feeling the weight of both memory and mystery. Before he could ask another question, the boy's knees buckled, and he collapsed on the doorstep. Richard caught him just in time, feeling how light he was, just skin and bones. He carried the child inside, laying him gently on the couch. The boy's skin was burning with fever, and his wrists bore scars, thin white lines that spoke of hunger, pain, and struggle. Richard rushed to the kitchen, fetched water, and placed a damp cloth on the boy's forehead. As he watched the child's chest rise and fall, fragments of Michael's face flickered in his mind. He sat beside the boy all night. The clock ticked softly in the silence, and outside, coyotes howled in the distance. Richard couldn't stop staring at that shirt. It had been buried with his son's belongings, sealed away with medals and letters from the army. How could it end up here, in the hands of a child who spoke of Michael as if he had seen him alive just yesterday? The possibilities frightened him, but more than that, they awakened something long buried inside him. Hope, fragile and reckless. As dawn approached, the boy stirred, his lips parting slightly. Richard leaned closer, hearing him whisper a name, Noka. The syllables were soft, foreign, maybe Apache. He remembered stories from the local reservation about children who vanished into the desert during the long droughts, never to return. Richard poured a bit of water into a cup and held it to the boy's lips. "Drink slowly," he murmured. The boy obeyed, his eyes flickering open again. "He told me to find you," he said weakly. "He said, you were his father." Tears welled in Richard's eyes. "My son?" he asked, barely believing the words coming from his own mouth. The boy nodded. "He saved me when I was lost. He gave me this shirt. He told me to tell you he's not gone." A chill ran down Richard's spine. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying the whisper of the desert across the hills. The boy drifted back into sleep, and Richard sat frozen, his mind spinning between logic and the impossible. Morning light poured through the window, painting the walls gold. Richard brewed fresh coffee and sat across from the boy, still asleep on the couch. He thought of Michael, the day they buried him, the folded flag, the 21-gun salute. He thought of the years of silence that followed, the guilt that had gnawed at him since losing both wife and son. Now this child had come, carrying not just a shirt but a message that defied reason. Richard decided that once the boy recovered, he would find the truth, no matter how deep into the desert it led him. Later that afternoon, the boy woke again, weak but more aware. Richard introduced himself gently. "I'm Richard Harris," he said. "You're safe here." The boy stared at him, eyes dark and unreadable. "My name is Noka," he replied. "He said you'd understand." "Understand what?" Richard asked quietly. Noka pointed to the shirt folded on the chair. "He said it's a promise, that he'll never stop watching over you." The words hit Richard like a memory returned from the grave. He could almost hear Michael's laughter, see his crooked grin, the way he used to salute playfully before leaving for duty. That night, Richard sat on the porch, watching the horizon turn red beneath the dying sun. The desert stretched endlessly, beautiful and cruel. Somewhere out there, his son's spirit, or something connected to him, had found this boy and led him home. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel alone. He didn't have answers, but he had purpose. The mystery of how the shirt reached that boy might never make sense, yet it carried something greater than proof, it carried faith. Inside the house, Noka slept peacefully, wrapped in a blanket too large for his small frame. Richard placed the shirt beside him and whispered softly, "Thank you, Michael." The wind outside settled into a calm hush, as if the desert itself had heard. And in that moment, Richard Harris knew one thing with certainty: the knock on his door had not been random. It was the echo of love that even death could not silence. 4 days had passed since the night the boy had arrived at Richard's door, half dead and holding his son's shirt. The doctors at Prescott Memorial had done all they could, feeding the boy warm soup, giving him medicine, and letting him rest. Noka, as he called himself, spoke little, but when he did, it was always about the desert, about someone who had saved him when he was lost, someone who looked like Michael. Those words kept echoing in Richard's mind. Logic said it was impossible, yet his heart refused to let go. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to find them, out there, in the desert where it had all begun. The morning he left, the sky was a pale silver, the air dry and still. He packed his old army canteen, a compass, and Michael's photo. Driving west beyond the town limits, the paved road soon disappeared into cracked soil and drifting sand. The sun climbed higher, painting the horizon in gold and crimson. As the miles rolled by, the world grew quieter. No cars, no birds, just the hum of wind and the low growl of the truck's engine. Hours later, Richard found traces of a camp, ashes, broken bottles, footprints half buried in the sand. He stepped out and crouched near a burned fire pit. Something about the ashes felt recent. Someone had been here not long ago. He walked slowly, scanning the ground like a soldier in enemy territory. There were scattered canteens, torn blankets, and an old woven bracelet, Apache craftsmanship. The sight hit him with a strange mix of sorrow and curiosity. Who were these people, and what did they have to do with his son? As the sun began to fall, Richard stood on a ridge overlooking the endless desert. The silence was so deep it almost roared in his ears. He whispered into the wind, "Michael, if you can hear me, give me something, anything." The air shifted, warm, then cool. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a figure at the edge of the dunes, tall and still, watching him. Then it was gone. By the time he returned home, twilight had draped Prescott in purple light. The desert wind followed him back like an unseen companion, whispering through the dry brush. As he parked his truck in the driveway, something caught his attention: 3 figures standing quietly on his porch. His pulse quickened. They were women, wrapped in woven shawls, their faces marked with both pride and pain. Their presence carried the weight of something sacred, something ancient. Richard stepped out slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. The eldest among them stepped forward, her eyes wise and steady. "You already have," she said. "The boy you saved, he belongs to us." Richard's heart skipped. "You mean Noka?" The woman nodded. "Yes. He is Apache. Our blood, our child. We have been looking for him." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but emotion long held back. Richard felt a strange sense of relief, but also confusion. "Then why did he come to me?" he asked softly. The woman looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Because your son told him to." She reached into her woven bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. Her hands, though old, moved with care as she handed it to Richard. Inside the bundle was a folded paper, yellowed and creased, tied with a thin string. Richard's fingers shook as he untied it. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Michael's. The sight of those letters made his chest tighten. Alongside the letter was a small, worn photograph of Michael, taken before deployment. His son's familiar grin stared back at him. Richard unfolded the paper and began to read. "Dad, if you ever meet a child named Noka, help him. He saved me once in the desert. He's family now." The world went silent. The sound of his own breathing was the only thing he could hear. Tears welled in Richard's eyes as he clutched the paper to his chest. His son's handwriting, his words, his kindness, it was all real, alive again through this message carried across time and death. "How did you get this?" he whispered. The woman replied, "After your son fell, his things were returned to the people who found him. Among them was this letter. It was meant for you, but fate had other plans." The 2 younger women bowed their heads respectfully. The eldest continued, "We tried to bring Noka back to us, but he was lost in the desert before we could find him. Now he has been found, because your son's spirit guided him." Richard felt a tear roll down his cheek, then another. The night wind began to rise, whistling through the trees. He looked up at the sky, where thunderclouds were gathering, lit by flashes of distant lightning. "Michael," he murmured, voice trembling, "you kept your promise." The 3 women stood silently, their shawls fluttering in the wind. They didn't need to say more. They had delivered what was meant to reach him, a bridge between 2 worlds, between the living and the dead. He invited them inside, offering water and warmth. They spoke of Noka's village, of how he had wandered into the desert after a great fire. They spoke of the connection their people believed in, How spirits guided the living when love refused to fade. Each word they said carried a truth that science could never measure. When they left, one of the women touched his hand and said, "Your son's heart was strong. It still beats in what he saved." Their footsteps faded into the night, leaving behind the scent of desert sage. Later that night, the rain began. Richard sat by the window, watching it fall across the land. Lightning flashed, illuminating the photograph of Michael and the letter beside it. He read the words again and again, his tears mixing with silent gratitude. Somewhere deep in his soul, the ache that had lived there for years began to ease. He realized that death hadn't taken Michael away, it had simply changed the way he existed. His son had not vanished, he had found a way to reach across the impossible to deliver one last act of kindness. As thunder rolled across the Arizona sky, Richard closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, son." Outside, the desert breathed. The rain fell harder, washing the dust from the earth, cleansing it like a promise fulfilled. In that moment, Richard understood something unexplainable. Love doesn't die, it transforms. Bonds forged in sacrifice and compassion never truly break. They only find new forms, new faces, new reasons to come home. And that night, as the storm raged on, Richard Harris finally found peace, not in answers, but in the presence of something eternal.